In this video, we'll walk through macros, starting with just how to record them and getting into how to edit them. But before we do that, just a couple reminders for this week. Just a reminder, those that have the lab section on Tuesday, you will be required to take one of the other lab sections. So there's several that have been presented. You can look on the class syllabus to see where those are, or we'll be offering a lab on Friday from 12 to 2. So any one of those lab sections, either the current existing ones on Wednesday or Thursday, or you can do the Friday from 12 to 2. If you do the Friday from 12 to 2, it will be on the regular Zoom link, and you can just attend at that time. Other than that, there is one discussion item just around pre-labs. I realized through a series of you guys reminding me that the pre-labs actually were offset 1 week in terms of the due dates comparative to everything else, which made it a little confusing. I am going to leave it that way. What that means is just that you can turn your pre-lab in up to a week late and it'll still be fine. So I'm not going to adjust everything since the schedule was set that way. And so that, again, your pre-labs, what has been articulated is not true. It's actually a week after that they're due. I would encourage you to get it done earlier just so we can give you more feedback on that. But that is how that is set. So for this week, we're going to look at doing the macro. And so if you don't have a developer tab up here, there's a couple ways to get that. That you can either right click over here and customize the ribbon. So right click and customize, or you can go through the regular file menu and go through and make sure that developer tab does show up. There is a place to kind of select that in there. So if you're having trouble with that, some of the videos cover that. But you will find as we transition into this period that if you have a Mac, there's going to be some differences. So I'd highly encourage you to use the virtual platform, the virtual lab computers for this, because there are some limitations on what you can do on a Mac versus on a PC. I don't know why they do that, but that is kind of the reality between the Mac and the PC, that Excel itself is different based on these macros things. I think that is because of Mac really clamping down on other programming stuff that has a potential for malware. Now, when you open this file, you'll start off with, there is going to be some code in here that just says start the macro, and so or enable macros. And part of that discussion on those macros basically causing viruses and things like that, there is a potential to house viruses inside of these macros. That's why there is an extra warning there. So you do have to be careful with that. You should be able to, in this file, just say okay and move forward, obviously, but be cautious with other files as you look at that. So what we're going to do here again is macros. Under the developer tab, you'll see that there is some code items right here. We have Visual Basic, macros, record macros, relative reference. And this is really where we're going to spend all of our time today, is in these items right here. So we're going to start off with just the record macro. So I'm going to click that button, and it's going to come up with this right here, and we're just going to type in here some sort of code for that, or a name for that. We'll do record. Do just notice that you can put in here a Control R. Basically, what this is a shortcut for calling the macro, so you can do it that way. And always want to put it in this workbook here. So make sure that it's in this workbook, not a new workbook. You can put it in some sort of house workbook, but then when you send the file, it doesn't have the macros inside of it. Make sure that that's always set to this workbook, which is the default. So we'll hit OK there. Now, anything I do is going to get recorded as I do it. So I'm going to just click into cell D3 here and put equals minimum of these values right here. And I'll hit enter, and then down here, I will put equals maximum, or max of those same values. Now, you can do formulas like that. You can enter code. You can also come in here and change colors and things like that. So in this case here, I've just changed the text color, or you could change the other colors. And then I would come back to the developer tab and hit stop recording. Now, under the macros, you'll see that there's now a record, and I can edit that, and that's going to bring up this window right here. Like that, and so we can see what's actually going on in this workbook. So I'm going to try and put that just to the side so we can see both happening at the same time. And I'm going to close this up here. Here's going to be the text of what happened, and you'll notice we start to see things that occurred as we went through there. So first thing we did was select that cell D3. And let me just get this all situated. Just move that over so we can see what's going on. So again, we selected cell D3, that's right here, and then active cell.formula. You'll notice that the notation on here is a little bit confusing, and it says minimum. We put in a formula there, and then RC stands for row column, and I went back 2 rows, sorry, over 2, minus 2 columns, same row, meaning I selected right here. That's what that means. So rows the same, -2 on the columns, I went here, and then rows this row 9, so I went 9 down and went to -2. So that means I drug from here down to there. So this is using a reference to figure out from my current cell how many rows did I go over, how many columns did I go over. And you can do that for ranges or just for cells. Then I went down and I selected D4 and then did the same thing where I'm selecting that range right there. You'll notice that the R is different now here because I'm 1 cell down. I'm now down here. So when I went over to rows, I went up a row, which is negative, and then I went down 8 rows, which would be positive on the way down there. Then you can go and see where it gets really kind of confusing is a lot of the basically formatting. So formatting is going to be different than just putting in formulas and things like that. That formatting has a lot of different things here that really we wouldn't understand anything. What is the tint and shade at this value? And all those stuff like that. If you do formatting, sometimes it's good to separate out the formatting from the regular stuff. But you'll notice here, if I come back, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to get rid of this, and I'm going to change this back under the Home tab just to the same. Let's go back to the way it was, like that. And then what I'm going to do is go to that Developer tab again and hit Macros, and I'm going to just hit Run here. Now everything went back to the way it was. Again, it went through that exact same code as I went through there. You'll notice as well that what I'm going to do here is hit Control R, and Control R does the same thing again because I set it as a shortcut. Another thing you can do is if we go ahead and add in a shape here, and I'm just going to make a button down here like this, and you can put in text for put a text on there, but I'm going to just right click on that, it will let me, and hit Assign Macro, and I can basically select Record there. So by doing that, I now have a button in this macro, and so again I can get rid of this, and if I hit that, it runs the macro. So you can think of this as like setting a button in there for those macros. Now if I come over to the next page here and I run that same macro, I'm going to hit Control R. You'll see that it does the exact same thing. And so you can basically use this on another page. So it doesn't only do it on that tab, but it does it on whatever tab that you want to, unless you have it set to only go to a specific tab there. So that's kind of what happens on that one. Now let's look at doing another one. We're going to do something called relative reference on this one. And I'm going to start off by just doing what we just did for this average and standard deviation. So we're going to go back to Developer. Okay, so and I'm going to record that macro again. Here's my record button. And I'm going to call this no relative reference. That's for no, again, the RR is for relative reference there. And I'm going to put this as S. Control S will be what I call to do it. And now we're recording. I'm going to come in here, put in average, and get those 3 numbers. Same thing down here, equals STDEV. Those numbers as well. So I get the average and standard deviation, and sure enough, I have those values. Now notice over here, you can actually watch, if you have this split screen, you could watch what happened over here. We selected cell B6, and then went to B7, and then B8, and in each one I'm going down and putting the next, or giving the value that I'm going to put in there with the right formula. Now I'll go ahead and stop that. So that one is done. You'll notice that no matter where I start my cursor here, if I start my cursor over here and like this, and I hit macros, or actually I'll hit the Control S, and it does it over there. It doesn't matter where my cursor starts again, it's going to put it, Control S, back in those cells right there. Now what I can do instead is actually set it to do what we call relative reference. So it's always starting from that given cell and referencing the correct place. So this button right below record is relative reference, and when I hit that, nothing magic happens or nothing comes up, no box pops up, but you'll notice that it's grayed out there. And this is called relative reference, and what I want to do is just watch and see what happens when we do this one versus the last one. So I'm going to hit record here, and then now I'm going to call this relative reference, call it T, we'll do that one, and hit OK. And now we're going to come in, you can see, and watch what happens to the code over here that I put this in, is I'm going to put equals average, these three numbers, and then down here equals standard deviation, those values like that. Now I'm going to go ahead and stop that, and we have two bits of code here. One of them starts right at cell B6, but if you notice this one does not start at B6, what happens here is we just select that active cell. So this is always going to be relative to where you start your cursor. So it's important, if you have your cursor set in a certain place, it will then do it relative to that right there. So I started my cursor in here, and that then parsed down and went through this piece right here. You'll notice that this part is the same. When you put in the code, it's the same. It's relative to whatever cell you're in there. But as I go down, instead of going and selecting B7, now I select active cell.offset, which is basically saying I'm going down one cell. So there's an offset of, again, row, column. So RC is kind of how that's set there. So that means I'm going down a row and I'm not going over any columns right there. And then we would hit just select. So that's selecting that cell right below there. And this comes in very handy as I go through and look at using this in something like this. So if that, in that case here, if I was to call the first macro, Control S, it would do that first one. Now, because it doesn't matter where that cursor is, so on this second try here, if we come over to any one of these ranges, and if I do the Control S, it's going to go to the original one. But now if I do put this cursor there and hit Control T, it'll do it right here. So it is imperative that I do it in the right place, because if I go over here and the cursor is down one cell and I hit Control T, it's going to do it like this, and that's not pulling the right information. So when you use the relative reference, just make sure that you're putting it in the cursor in the right position to be able to operate that macro. Now, another thing you can do is, once we start to see kind of how things are working inside those macros, is be able to edit it inside here. So let's just look at a case like that. We're going to get rid of relative reference just for now. I'm going to record here, and then we're just going to call this one edit, and Control E. So I'm going to click into here, equals max of these values right there, and you got 68. So we'll go ahead and hit stop. We can see, what does it do? It selects D3, puts in the formula of max of, you can see that the row column, again, we're going to be in the same row for the first part of the array, and then go to -3, so we go back 3 columns there to do the other part of it. And then we, in terms of the next part of the array, you'll see it goes down 10 columns and then still over to that third column backwards or to the left. Now, if we take that and we use it in the next one, so if I come in here and hit Control E, here's what's happening. First off, the max value was over here, and so if I wanted to actually have that over here. This is pulling the information like there, but it actually doesn't pull all of the cells. Let's say that I want to have it be done in here, so I'm going to change the original cell over here to to C3, like that, and then I would have it go directly down from there. And so if I do this now and hit, now that that's saved, I'll go ahead and hit Control E, and it puts 0 in here. So now what's happening here, you'll notice that it does XFD 3, and what happens is it goes past A all the way to whatever, it's kind of circular back to the other way, the furthest cell in terms of columns. It kind of goes, if you went A to B to C to D to E, if you get all the way to Z, the next one is going to be AA, and then there's this large series of columns that gets created over and over and over, but it kind of is a round robin to where it goes back to that cell that way. So what needs to change over here, you'll notice that in this case, the columns that we go over is -3. Now if I go -3 from here, it's 1, 2, going all the way to that next column back over again, which was circular all the way back around, which is not what we want to do. So we want to put this as -2, and same thing here of -2. Now if I save that and perform that edit one, sure enough it gets a value here, but it actually is incorrect because it didn't actually pull all those values. So we want it to do 4 more values. So I need to take this value over here, this 10, and add 4 more to it. So the rows that it goes down is going to be 10. And at this point, if I come in and do Control E, sure enough, it comes out to be 71. So a lot of information there just about how these work, but notice that we can get into the text on that macro in Visual Basic and actually start making edits if we understand what's happening. Next thing we're going to do is basically copy and paste and use kind of an if statement inside of the macro text. So one of the things you could do if you were to do a macro with an if statement is you could say, I can come in here and record if in Excel, I'll just call this one I, and I could go in and say, okay, if, I'll come in here and say equals if this is equal to motorcycle, we're going to type good like that, and I'll put error if it's not. Okay, and you could basically have that, create that, and then if you wanted to, you could come down like this, all inside the macro, different things that's happening inside there, but it's basically doing an if statement through Excel. Okay, so I'm going to stop that real quick. That's one way to do an if statement inside of Excel. Now the way that we want to do it is realizing that you can do an if statement in VB or in Visual Basic here. So notice what I did here is I just actually grabbed some text for you guys to put in there. And so we're going to do that. We're actually going to make our own macro here. So we come to macros. I'm going to put in here if and put in VB. Now notice that there's nothing currently named that, so I just called it if VB. And if you make a new name in here, it allows you to just create a new one. So I'm going to create that new one, and I'm going to take the text that we have and just paste it right in there. Now here's what's going to happen in this one is it's going to look for the, it's going to basically say the variable of the current cell, active cell.value, is going to be equal to transpose. So wherever your cell currently is, it's going to put that in. Then if that value is motorcycle, then it's going to do an offset. So offset row column 1 to the right is going to be good. Remember that this offset right here again is row column RC. So that we don't go anywhere on the rows, but we're offsetting 1 column to the right, and we're putting in that value. We haven't moved the cursor, but just to the right of it, we're going to put a value. And it says if it's a moped, obviously that's not going to be good, and we're going to offset a value of bad, and then put error for anything else that's happening. So this is just kind of a general if statement. It processes through all of these things, and then it's going to end it and end that code. Now the question is, where do we start the code? And we're going to want to start it where it's pulling a value, so this is where the cursor is going to start right here. So let's just go ahead and save that and come down here and I'm going to get rid of the other values that we put in there. And I'm going to start it right here. We're going to have macro, the VB one, and it says good. Now it only does it for one, so I could come down here and do the same thing, run it again, and like that. Now if I started it here, any idea what would happen? Maybe take a quick guess on what would happen. Obviously there's portion there, which is, but if I come in here and run that macro, it does error, okay? The reason for that is it's pulling whatever's in this cell right here, and it doesn't see anything, so it just goes straight to error in there in order to do that. So that's kind of your generic if statement. Oftentimes in coding, you'll be able to pull an example of code from another set of code and then reutilize it somewhere else. Now, on this one, we're going to do the same thing. So we're going to, again, pretend that we're pulling code from somebody else and then just putting it into our cell and seeing what's going to happen. So we're asking, in this case here, I'm going to just directly copy this code. We're going to call it for loop. Do note if everything grays out here, most likely what happens is you're inside of this cell. If you're copying something and nothing shows up here, you have to hit escape to get out of that. I'm going to go to macros, call this for loop, create that one, and we'll come in here and put that in. Now, I'm going to just save this and then run it and ask you what do you think is going to happen in here. And you're going to see this for loop happen after we kind of select the sheet and the range A4. So it's going to go to A4 and then go through a series of things. Now notice in a for loop, what's happening is it's going to go through this loop for 10 times. For that basically saying we're going to loop through this same text or that same code there from I is equal to 1 to 10. So the first time around I is equal to 1, second time around I is equal to 2 until we hit 10. And each time it's going to do something. So the first time through, value I is equal to whatever I is. So we're setting this variable to whatever I is. Again, the first time through it's going to be 1. Second time through it's going to be 2. Then we're going to select the sheet and then go through active cell.value. Whatever the active cell is going to equal whatever that I value is. Okay, and then it's going to basically move it in a given direction. Now, does this move it down or to the right? Again, remember row, column. Row is right here, so it's going to go down a row. 1 down is a positive. And let's just watch what happens here. Here's what's frequently going to happen when you try to run your macros, something like this. It'll give you a subscript out of range. Okay, so if we go in here and debug that, it's going to basically highlight what it thinks might be wrong. Now you'll notice here that none of the sheets, none of the tabs down below actually have a sheet 1 here. So we're just going to pull the active one. And so in this case here, we're going to get rid of this and get rid of that. Like so. And sometimes, again, when you copy code, there's extra things in there that you need to make sure to get rid of and modify it if you understand the code correctly. And now let's try this again. We'll do macros, do that for loop, and run. Oops, I got to get out of here. So we're going to hit stop up here. That resets everything. If you're in the process of debugging, that yellow is showing up, you have to hit stop. And now you can either hit play from here or come into macros, for loop, run, and you can see sure enough it does it all the way down. Now if I were to do something like this and I change the code to 1, 1 and I save that, what's going to happen now? We're going to get an offset of row and column, and sure enough that will give you a diagonal line on the way down like that. Okay, so those are the for loop options, and then we're going to do a macro within a macro, and what this one's going to do is it's actually going to, in this case here, we're going to do a for loop 1 to I, and you'll notice here that there's this application.run. Any one of the macros that we've already set, you can actually go in and take that existing macro, whatever that name is, and run it inside of another macro. So here's, let's go ahead and do that real quick here. I'm going to pull this right here. Again, copying that, what we're going to do is macro in a macro. So let's go to our macros. Macro in macro. Create. And I'm going to just paste it in here you'll notice from before we can identify that we don't need to go to a sheet 1. We're just going to, if we don't have a sheet in there, it's just going to default to whatever sheet we have. In this case here, it's going to go to A4, which is right there. You'll notice that we want to change that to A5 down to here. And what we're going to do is we're going to run that if statement in the VB. So remember the if VB. So that if statement was for the Visual Basic, which looked in the cell that it was at and then put over here if it's good, bad, or whatever. Now in this case here, we're going to run 1 to 10. Now how many do we have here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So we do have 10 here. And we're going to run all the way through those. After each one that's run with that Visual Basic, it's going to go here and go down one cell again, row column, on the way down there. So let's go ahead and see if that works. And we will hit macros, macro and a macro, and hit run. And sure enough, it called the Visual Basic one, that code, for every one of those and did it all the way down like that. Okay. Now finally, let's just look at a simple kind of debugging one and see how this works in this case here. I'm going to just call this right off the bat and go, if we go to the debug example and just run that, you'll notice that there's some errors in here. And so one of the things that we want to learn in the process of doing this is that there are basically multiple times when you'll come up with some sort of code, and the ability to go in and debug is really powerful in learning how to diagnose this. You can get extremely frustrated in the process of looking through these things because as you go through them, like sometimes it's very nuanced things, very simple things that are difficult to address because it's just a semicolon or just something. Now, computer programs are getting better in terms of being able to identify and help you understand when loops end and when there's what should be going in certain places and where errors are at. But let's just look through this and see what happens. Okay, first thing we're going to do is loops, and this is going to bring up an input box here as we go through. And what it's going to do is select range E5. So E5 is actually over here. Instead of there, we probably want it to go over to C2. So let's just change this to C2. C2 like that, and we'll hit select. And then we're going to do a for loop all the way down, I into loops. Now, loops was defined as an input box, and what input box, we'll do more with this next time, but it's going to bring something up, and you're basically going to enter a value into that input box. So it's going to go 1 to whatever the loops is. So we would enter 5 in this case because we have 5 loops we want it to do there. And as it goes down, then it should go through that process into an if statement here. And you'll notice the if else here. So if it's circled, then it's going to go through and put in a given value here. If it's square, it's going to go through and do the value over there. So let's just see now, since we've kind of made some minor modifications, if anything changes here. We're in break mode here, so we're going to hit stop up here. That gets us out of break mode, and we're going to run that again. Okay, compile error, next without for. Okay, so we've got a next going out, but there's no for loop that it's being addressed in there. So we need to figure out what is going on with that. In this case, if we go back to the if statement in here, just a reminder, going back to this if statement. Oops. In that if statement we had, you'll notice here that there was an end if. So we go through if, else, but there was no end if here. So what's happening is it's doing an if statement and it's looking for that end if, and it gets to the next I, and it hasn't seen that yet, and it doesn't know what to do because that's associated with something else. So we have an end if. We need to end our if statement in here and hit save. So coming back to our sheet in the debug then, let's see what happens. We hit save and go to our macro. We'll run that one. enter the number of times. So it's actually getting into the code right now. So we'll hit 5 times. We want it to loop through. And it goes through and does error here. Okay, so it went through and went through everything, but notice that it didn't do it 5 times on the way down there. We didn't know what was happening as it went through there. So this for loop, it seemed like it was working, but it actually didn't do anything. Now, if you look in here, there is the active cell value.offset. You can see that there's basically pushing the value. It did do it over to there. Now, in this case here, we need to say, what is the active cell that we actually want it to look at? And it's actually pulling C2 is where it went, but it's not the right place because it's looking for this term here. And so we want this to be actually A2. So that's going to be A2. We're going to go into there. So that's going to start off there. Now, when we actually put in the value here, then we want the, we don't want the value. We don't want to change this value because that's where the cursor is going to be. We don't want to change that value, but we do want to say the active cell dot offset, and we want to go 2 over again, row column. So we're going to be in the same row over 2. That's setting saying that we're going to go over 2 into right here where that's going to be, and it's going to be equal to whatever's 1 over from that. Okay, so again, this is saying that the active cell offset, so this is the active cell offset 2 is going to be this cell. That cell is equal to active cell offset 1. That's this one because we're coming from this left cell A2 right here. That's what it's going to be multiplied by. And you're then taking that and squaring that value just for the case here. Now for a circle, that's actually not what we're going to do for radius or length. We're going to actually have to put pi in there and some things. But let's just see if we can get this to work with that value there and see what happens. So again, now we're going to hit save. And we'll hit run again. Oops. And hit OK. 5. Now, what happened in there? So in this case here, it actually put the an error in here, and then also these errors here. So something is still drastically wrong with what we're doing. So let's follow this one more time. If it's a circle, and this was circle, and this was a 4, just to be clear. Now it's going to put in here whatever the active cell offset 2, which should be this one. Just see that. Okay. It's going to put it in there. It's not going to be a square, so it won't recognize this, and else it's not going to do that because that's there. And then notice this one here is actually putting an active cell dot offset 1 is equal to error. So we don't actually need that because that's doing an alternate thing here. So what we want to do, remember that the cursor's right here, and we do want to move it down when we're done though. So when we do it down, we would go 1 and then 0 and then dot select. So select is just basically moving the cursor there. So let's see what happens now. Okay. 5. Now it went through and it did that, but it still didn't do that. So it still just stayed right up here and it didn't actually offset. Now notice it's only going to offset if it's under this if statement. Okay, if, else. Currently we have it set to where it only offsets if it is done in this else one here. If I had moved this up, it would do that offset, but in this case, so we need to put it down here after the end if. So once the end is done, then we would move the cell at this point. Okay, like that. Now I can hit save, get rid of that, and we'll go ahead and go here and run that example. Now we're going to run this 5 times, and something went drastically wrong based off where I had that. And it looks like I did not change this one right here. So you can see how challenging some of this can be. So let's go back here, square, circle, inside of this, we want to, again, make sure that these are set to the correct value here, or the correct location. So we're going to take these offset. That. Hit save, and now let's see what happens this time. We're going to save that, run that. 5 for our loop. Let's see, something it doesn't like right here. It's, again, that -1 there. Notice that -1. If we went -1 from here, that's going back this way, and it won't allow that. This needs to be an actual 1 there. And stop the debugger. And come to the macro. And run it. There you go. So now it works at this point, other than that we need to modify this to actually be the correct value here. Now, if we did that and wanted to go in and figure out what it is to do pi, if you'll remember, this is the radius or the length, pi r squared there. We want to look at what the pi value is. So in this, one of the things we can do here is just, we want to take that cell, pi times r squared. So we would need to find out what pi is. And you can either come in here and put 3.1415, something like that, which you're used to, and multiply, or you can actually go worksheet function dot pi. Let's see if I got that right. Hit save there, and then let's run it one more time. And run like that. 5 for that loop. Sure enough, then it does that the correct way. So again, you can see that there's a lot to be done in debugging. So as you get through here, there will be a certain part of frustration that comes with that, but just notice that you're learning in that process. You're learning to diagnose how that works. And again, in the diagnosis of debugging, make sure to work smaller rather than bigger in that process. Best of luck this week.